My father stood in the coat room of the Oak Ridge Country Club and told me to sign away my multi-million-dollar company to my older brother. He said it was for the good of the family. He said I owed them. When I slid the papers back and told him no, he threw me out of his house without a second thought, convinced I would lose everything and come crawling back. But I am a compliance auditor. I keep receipts. And none of them expected what happened when I finally opened my briefcase. I am 31 years old, and I run a healthcare compliance data firm in Chicago. I know how to spot a fraudulent claim before the ink is dry. I build systems that detect anomalies. Tonight, the anomaly was standing right in front of me wearing a custom tuxedo and sweating through his collar. It was my parents' 40th anniversary gala. 200 guests were out in the main ballroom. They were eating prime rib and drinking top-shelf champagne. A string quartet was playing near the grand staircase. From the outside, the Harper family looked like the picture of American success. But I was backed into the private coat room with my father, Richard, and a manila envelope. The air in the small room felt thick. It smelled like damp wool coats and my father's expensive scotch. He did not ask how my business was doing. He did not thank me for flying in for the party. He just placed the envelope on the mahogany table between us and tapped it twice with his index finger. "Sign it, Claire," he said. "It is just a transition plan." I opened the flap. Inside were transfer of ownership documents, 3 pages of dense legal text that boiled down to one simple command. I was to step down as chief executive officer of the firm I built from scratch. I was to transfer a 51% majority shareholder stake to my older brother Harrison, effectively handing him the keys, the revenue, and the absolute control. I looked through the half-open door into the main ballroom. Harrison was hovering near the bar. He held his drink with both hands. He was looking around the room like a man expecting to be arrested. Harrison is 34. He has the kind of tall, effortless look that makes people trust him before he even speaks. My parents spent their entire lives cultivating that look. They paid for the private tutors. They paid for the right fraternity. They bought his way into the right social circles. But Harrison had a fatal flaw. He was completely incompetent. I knew for a fact he had just been quietly fired from his 3rd executive role in 4 years. The official story at the country club was that he was pursuing other ventures. The real story was that he had cost his last employer millions in failed contracts because he could not be bothered to read the compliance terms. He thought rules were for other people. My parents built their entire identity on the Oak Ridge Country Club social ladder. A son who was unemployable was a stain they could not afford. They needed a life raft. They needed a face-saving narrative to tell their wealthy friends. Harrison taking over a successful growing tech firm was the perfect cover story. It sounded brilliant. It sounded exactly like the kind of success my father wanted to brag about on the golf course. The only problem was that the company belonged to me. In my family, obedience was not requested. It was demanded. My father expected me to look at the papers, feel the crush of his disappointment, and sign my life away just to keep the peace. I was the invisible daughter. I was the one who was supposed to absorb the impact so Harrison could shine. I did not do that. I picked up my glass of sparkling water. The ice clinked against the crystal. I took a slow sip. The silence in the coat room grew heavy. My father crossed his arms, waiting for my submission. I set the glass down. I put my hand flat over the documents and slid them directly back across the smooth wood of the table. "No," I said. Just one word, flat and final. My father blinked. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck visibly strained. "Excuse me," he said. I kept my voice perfectly level. It was the exact tone I use when explaining a regulatory violation to a hostile board of directors. I said, "No, Dad. Harrison could not run a lemonade stand, let alone a healthcare compliance firm. He would bankrupt my company in 6 months. I am not signing anything." That was when Harrison pushed through the velvet curtains and stepped into the coat room. He was followed closely by his wife, Jessica. Jessica wore a silk gown that cost more than my first car. She looked at me with the kind of smug manufactured pity that only lives in wealthy suburbs. She stepped right up to the table, completely invading my personal space. "Let us be honest, Claire," Jessica scoffed. "It is not really your company to keep, is it? We all know how you started it." I stared at her. She was referring to the money. 5 years ago, I was 26. I was working brutal night shifts at a hospital data center to fund my startup. I was eating cheap noodles and sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a freezing studio apartment. My father had written me a check for $50,000. He told me it was a gift to help me make rent, so I could focus on writing the software. It was the one and only time he had ever supported my ambitions. Now Jessica was weaponizing it. "Richard gave you that seed money," Jessica said, crossing her arms. "That makes him the primary investor. He is a silent partner. And as a partner, he has the legal authority to reassign leadership for the good of the family portfolio." Harrison nodded beside her. He was gaining confidence now that his wife was doing the talking. "It is just business," Claire Harrison said. "I have the executive presence to take the firm public. You are great at the back-end stuff. You can stay on as chief operating officer. It is a win for everyone." I looked at the three of them. My father, my brother, my sister-in-law. They had cornered me in a coat room during a gala, assuming the social pressure would break me. They thought I would be too embarrassed to fight back. They thought I was just a naive girl playing with computers. They did not understand that I build corporate structures for a living. I know the law. A personal gift without a signed operating agreement equity schedule or articles of incorporation carries zero legal weight. My father was not a silent partner. He was just a man who wrote a check. But I did not argue the law with them. Arguing gives people the illusion that their point is valid. I just picked up my purse and looked directly at my father. "My answer is no," I said. My father stepped forward, blocking the door. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. "If you walk out that door without signing these papers," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "you are no longer part of this family. And you can get your things out of my guest house tonight." I had been staying in their guest estate for 3 months, completely putting my own life on hold to care for my mother after her knee replacement. I cooked her meals, managed her physical therapy, and ran my company remotely. And he was threatening to throw me out on the street simply because I refused to hand my life over to his golden boy. I did not cry. I did not beg. I checked my silver watch. "I will be out by midnight," I said. I pushed past him, walked through the heavy oak doors, and left the country club. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving them standing in the coat room with their worthless transfer documents. Before I tell you what I found hidden in Harrison's financial footprint that night, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love reading them. If you have ever been expected to set yourself on fire to keep your family warm, this story is for you. My father did not handle the word no. In his world, a world built on golf course handshakes, corporate mergers, and country club hierarchies, defiance was not an option. It was a breach of contract. I watched the blood rush to his face. His skin turned a deep mottled purple. The heavy oak door of the coat room was slightly ajar. Through the crack, the bright, sparkling sounds of the gala drifted in. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the string quartet playing Vivaldi. It all felt absurdly out of place against the suffocating smell of Jessica's expensive floral perfume, hanging heavy in the small, stifling room. Richard took a step toward me. He was a large man, entirely used to using his physical presence to intimidate boardrooms into submission. He tried it now. "You are going to sign those papers, Claire," he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a toxic rage he was barely keeping in check. "You are going to sign them because I made you. I gave you the money to start that little project of yours. I put a roof over your head when you needed it." He reached out and pushed the heavy coat room door wide open. He wanted the passing guests to hear. He wanted the threat of public humiliation to force my hand. In his mind, I was still the quiet, invisible daughter who would do anything to avoid making a scene. He knew how much I hated drawing attention to myself, but he forgot that I no longer cared about his social standing. I cared about the facts. If you walk out of this room without signing your company over to your brother, you are no longer my daughter, he announced. His voice echoed into the hallway, bouncing off the polished marble tiles. 2 women in beaded dresses paused, their eyes widening as they pretended to look at a painting. "You are cut off. You are dead to us. And you can get your things out of my guest house tonight." Let us talk about that guest house for a moment. I had never asked to live there. I owned a beautiful, quiet loft in downtown Chicago. I had a life, a routine, a thriving compliance data firm that required my absolute attention. But 3 months ago, my mother Susan required a highly complex knee replacement. She needed round-the-clock care. Harrison lived 20 minutes away in a luxury condo my parents had quietly co-signed for him. But Harrison claimed he was simply too busy networking and exploring new executive opportunities to help. Jessica claimed she had a sensitive stomach and could not deal with medical recovery or physical therapy. So the invisible daughter was summoned. I paused my life. I packed a suitcase. I moved into the guest estate on my parents' property. For 90 days, I was the one waking up at dawn to manage Susan's rigorous physical therapy routine. I was the one cooking her specialized low-sodium meals, tracking her complicated pain medication schedules, and helping her bathe. I ran my entire business remotely, taking high-stakes video calls from a tiny desk in the guest room at 2 in the morning while they all slept peacefully. My reward for 3 months of unpaid, unappreciated labor was being publicly evicted in a country club hallway. All because I refused to hand my multi-million-dollar business to a brother who had not even bothered to bring our mother a single bowl of soup. Richard stood there, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored suit, waiting for the collapse. He fully expected me to crumble. He expected tears. He expected me to panic, to apologize, and to beg for my place in the family hierarchy. He wanted me to grab the gold pen from his pocket, sign the transfer documents, and apologize for my terrible selfishness. Jessica had a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face, confident that the poor little sister had finally been put in her place. Harrison looked massively relieved, eager to snatch the keys to my kingdom and fix his own hidden failures. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification. In compliance auditing, we have a very strict rule. You never argue with a hostile party. You simply document the violations, secure your assets, and walk away. I looked at my father. I saw the absolute certainty in his eyes that he had won. Then I looked at Harrison sweating through his expensive tuxedo, desperate to steal a life he could never build for himself. I looked at Jessica drowning in her own manufactured superiority. Finally, I looked down at my wrist. I checked my silver watch. It was the watch I bought myself the day my firm hit its first million in annual revenue. It was 8:45 in the evening. I will have my things out by midnight, I said. The words hung in the air, sharp and clean and perfectly cold. The smug smile on Jessica's face froze instantly. Harrison blinked, totally uncomprehending, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. My father opened his mouth to speak, but the wind had been completely knocked out of his sails. He had played his absolute highest card, the threat of total excommunication, and I had simply agreed to the terms without a flinch. I did not wait for a response. I adjusted the strap of my purse, stepped neatly around my father's imposing frame, and walked out into the bright hallway. The two women in the beaded dresses quickly looked away, pretending they had not heard every single word of the eviction. I kept my head high and my posture perfectly straight. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic beat against the floor of the country club lobby. I pushed through the heavy glass front doors, handed my ticket to the valet, and stepped out into the cool, dark night. I got into my car. I put the keys in the ignition. I did not look back at the glowing windows of the grand ballroom. I just put the car in drive and pulled away from the only family I had ever known. The guest house was completely silent when I arrived. It was strangely quiet, the kind of heavy stillness that settles over a place when you know you are never coming back to it. I walked into the bedroom I had occupied for the last 3 months. The detailed medical schedules I had painstakingly drawn up for my mother were still pinned to the corkboard above the desk. The thick stack of compliance reports I had been reviewing that morning sat neatly beside my laptop. I pulled my suitcase from the closet. I am a highly methodical person. I pack the exact same way I build corporate data systems. Organized, efficient, no wasted movement. I folded my clothes. I gathered my encrypted hard drives. I boxed up the small espresso machine I had brought from my apartment. The whole process took exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. By 11:30, my car was entirely packed. I stood in the center of the empty guest house living room holding my heavy navy blue briefcase. The house felt cold. The reality of what had just happened was finally beginning to settle over me. 20 minutes ago, I had a family. Now I was entirely on my own. But as I looked around the vacant room, I did not feel a sense of loss. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of relief. The heavy, suffocating debt of their expectations was gone. I took my spare key, placed it carefully on the kitchen counter, locked the front door behind me, and drove into the city. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we untangle the messy reality of family expectations and learn the quiet power of walking away. Before I tell you what I found hidden in Harrison's financial footprint that night, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. If you have ever been expected to set yourself on fire to keep your family warm, this story is for you. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you are ready for the truth. The sun does not rise over the Chicago skyline so much as it bleeds through the morning fog. I sat at my glass desk on the 42nd floor. It was 6 in the morning. My coffee was black and the executive suite was perfectly silent. I had slept for exactly 4 hours on the sleek leather sofa in my office. I woke up feeling sharper than I had in months. When you spend your entire life waiting for the other shoe to drop, there is a profound physical relief in finally watching it hit the floor. My personal cell phone buzzed against the glass tabletop. I glanced at the bright screen. Richard was awake, and he was actively executing his playbook. The first email was an automated alert from the boutique wealth management firm that handled our family trust. The message was entirely clinical. My access portal had been permanently suspended. The second email arrived 3 minutes later. It was a notification from the regional hospital network back home. I had been removed as the primary medical proxy and emergency contact for my mother. He was trying to cut my oxygen lines. In my father's mind, wealth and access were the only lifelines that mattered in this world. He assumed I relied on the safety net of his grand estate. He thought that by locking the iron gates to the family kingdom, I would freeze out in the cold and come knocking on his door before lunch. It was a classic corporate siege tactic. Cut off resources, isolate the target, wait for the inevitable surrender. But my father made a critical miscalculation. He forgot what I actually do for a living. I do not rely on safety nets. I build fortresses. I put my phone on silent mode and pushed it to the far edge of the desk. I opened my laptop and entered my security credentials. It was time to go to work. As a healthcare compliance director, my entire professional existence revolves around mitigating catastrophic risk. When a massive hospital system faces a federal audit, I am the person who digs through millions of lines of code to find the single vulnerability before the government regulators do. I do not deal in emotional threats. I deal in bulletproof paper trails. I opened my encrypted server drive and pulled up the foundational documents for my firm. 5 years ago, when Richard handed me that $50,000 check, he had waved away my attempts to document the transaction. He had laughed his booming laugh and told me family does not need paperwork. But I knew even then that unwritten money is a loaded gun waiting to go off. I had refused to deposit his funds until he signed a formal gift letter. I drafted the document myself on a cheap laptop in my freezing studio apartment. I explicitly stated the money was a one-time personal gift, given without expectation of repayment, without future equity, and completely without operational control. I made him sign it in blue ink. I kept the original copy. I forwarded the digital file to my corporate attorney, Jonathan. I typed a brief direct message asking him to review the founding ledger and confirm that our corporate veil remained completely unpierced. Jonathan is a meticulous lawyer who wakes up earlier than I do. He replied 12 minutes later. His response was exactly what I expected. The gift tax return was filed perfectly 5 years ago. There are no silent partners. There is no shadow equity. Your father has zero legal standing to claim a single percentage of this company. Jessica had based her entire smug courtroom threat on a magnificent delusion. My family genuinely thought because I accepted a small life raft when I was drowning, they owned the ocean I eventually conquered. But their arrogant assumptions meant absolutely nothing against a notarized signature and a pristine capitalization table. My firm belonged entirely to me. The walls were secure, or so I thought. At 8 in the morning, my assistant arrived and the outer office began to hum with daily activity. I locked my office door and initiated my end-of-week security protocols. Every single Friday, I run a comprehensive diagnostic on my company credentials. It is an obsessive habit born from working with highly sensitive medical data. You have to monitor your own perimeter just as closely as you monitor your clients. I logged into our corporate credit monitoring dashboard. The screen populated with green check marks indicating our flawless payment history and our top-tier business credit score. I scrolled down the page, ready to close the tab and start my morning meetings. But as my eyes scanned the recent activity log, I stopped breathing. The cursor hovered over a single glaring anomaly. There was a hard credit inquiry on my company employer identification number. My heart slammed against my ribs. A hard pull on a corporate EIN does not happen by accident. It is not a routine background check or a simple vendor verification. A hard inquiry is the undeniable digital footprint of an active commercial loan application. Someone had attempted to leverage my company data to apply for massive corporate credit. I rapidly pulled the detailed inquiry report. The request originated exactly 21 days ago. The inquiring institution was not a standard commercial bank. It was a high-yield, high-risk private equity lending group based out of New York. They were the kind of firm that specializes in fast cash mezzanine debt and aggressive bridge loans for desperate borrowers. They charge exorbitant interest rates and require ironclad collateral to secure their funds. I sat back in my chair. The ergonomic mesh suddenly felt very rigid against my spine. I closed my eyes and let the jagged pieces of the puzzle snap into a terrifying picture. Everything about the previous night had felt unnaturally rushed. My father had summoned me to a cramped coat room during a major social event. He had pushed the transfer documents across the table with a strange, frantic energy. Harrison had been sweating through his expensive tuxedo shirt, clutching his drink like a man facing a firing squad. They had demanded I sign the company over to my brother immediately, right then and there, without allowing me a single day to have my own legal team review the paperwork. It was not a spontaneous power grab born out of pure ego. It was a strict deadline. Harrison had been quietly fired from his executive job months ago. He had always tried to live like a billionaire on a millionaire budget. He flew first-class leased exotic cars and threw money at terrible investments to impress people who did not care about him. He had clearly stepped into a financial bear trap he could not buy his way out of. And Richard, desperate to protect the sacred family image from a public bankruptcy, had offered up the only viable asset left on the board: my thriving company. They had already initiated the loan process. Harrison had gone to the private equity lenders 3 weeks ago. He had confidently presented my compliance firm as his own asset, or at least an asset he was about to legally control. The aggressive lenders had run the credit check on my EIN to verify the company valuation and confirm the revenue streams. Now the private creditors were waiting for the final proof of ownership. They were waiting for the signed transfer documents I had just refused to hand over in the coat room. My father did not ambush me at the anniversary gala because he wanted to put me in my place. He ambushed me out of sheer unadulterated panic. The financial countdown had already started. The creditors were circling the waters, and my family was running completely out of time. Arrogance is a fascinating vulnerability. It makes people remarkably sloppy. They become so deeply convinced of their own inevitable victory that they completely stop checking their blind spots. Jessica has always been a textbook example of this particular phenomenon. She navigates the world operating under the firm assumption that everyone else is simply an unpaid extra in the grand, sweeping movie of her life. At 2:15 that afternoon, the heavy glass doors of my firm swung open. I was sitting at my desk quietly cross-referencing a series of compliance logs when I heard the unmistakable sharp click of her red Christian Louboutin heels striking the polished concrete floor of my lobby. Jessica had never once visited my company in the 3 years since I opened our downtown headquarters. She had always made it very clear that she considered my work to be a tedious, unattractive little hobby. Yet here she was standing in the exact center of my reception area, inspecting the space with the critical, hungry eye of a real estate developer flipping a distressed property. Through the frosted glass wall of my office, I watched her interact with my receptionist, David. She was pointing a manicured finger at the custom acoustic panels we had installed near the high ceilings, making a face that suggested she found them deeply offensive to her personal aesthetic. I stepped out of my office just in time to hear her ask David exactly what the usable square footage of the floor plan was. She said it incredibly casually, as if she were planning to knock down the structural walls, and wanted to know exactly how much room she had for a corner executive suite. David looked at her with polite professional confusion. He was highly trained to handle aggressive federal auditors and hostile corporate attorneys, so a suburban housewife in a tweed blazer wielding a designer handbag did not rattle him in the slightest. I walked over and quietly told David I would handle the guest. Jessica spun around the moment she heard my voice. She offered a tight, perfectly practiced smile that did not even attempt to reach her cold eyes. She reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out 3 envelopes bound tightly by a rubber band. "I brought your mail, Claire," she announced. Her voice was intentionally loud, deliberately bouncing off the reception walls so anyone in the adjacent cubicles could hear her. "We found it sitting on the kitchen counter at the guest house after you ran off in such a hurry last night. Richard thought you might desperately need your bills since you are on your own now." It was a completely fabricated excuse. My business and personal mail had been forwarded to a private secure post office box since the very first day I moved into their estate. The envelopes she handed me were junk mail catalogs and a random grocery coupon flyer that had been sitting in their recycling bin. She had driven 45 minutes into the city through heavy afternoon traffic just to mark her territory and gloat. I took the envelopes from her outstretched hand. "Thank you, Jessica," I said. I kept my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "Was there anything else you needed today?" She did not take the extremely obvious hint. Instead, she stepped past me, invading my personal space, and peered directly through the open door into my private office. She took in the dual monitors, the massive glass whiteboard covered in complex regulatory schedules, and the sweeping, unobstructed view of the Chicago River. "It is a decent starter space," she noted, running her fingers along the edge of my assistant's desk. "But Harrison will definitely want to modernize it. He has such a fantastic eye for corporate culture. I am thinking we bring in a decorator by next week to brighten up these dismal gray walls." I let her talk. In my profession, you learn very quickly that when you remain absolutely silent, people who love the sound of their own voice will inevitably rush to fill the vacuum. They will keep talking until they hand you the exact rope you need to hang them. "I suppose you are packing up your desk today," Jessica continued. Her tone shifted from breezy condescension to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is really for the best, Claire. You have to admit you are entirely in over your head here. Harrison is meeting with the private credit guys tomorrow morning to finalize the transition. He is signing the term sheets at 10 o'clock sharp. It will be so nice for him to finally take this little operation to the next level." My heart gave a single hard thud against my ribs. My face remained an absolute impenetrable mask of boredom. Private credit guys. She had just handed me the missing half of the map. She genuinely thought she was taunting me with my brother's impending triumph. She had absolutely no idea she was handing a certified compliance auditor the exact timeline and location of a major federal financial crime. "I appreciate the update," I said. I stepped back and held the heavy lobby door open for her. "Drive safely." She huffed, clearly annoyed that I had not broken down in tears or thrown a screaming tantrum, and marched out into the corridor. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut, the lock engaging with a solid thud, I went straight back to my desk. I locked my office door. I threw the junk mail directly into the shredder and opened a secure encrypted browser on my primary monitor. Jessica had just confirmed my darkest suspicion. The hard credit inquiry on my company identification number was not a preliminary phishing expedition. It was an active, finalized commercial loan agreement. They were signing the binding term sheets tomorrow morning at 10. I needed to know exactly how deep the hole was. I needed to understand why a man who had supposedly just walked away from a comfortable executive position to pursue other interests was frantically leveraging a stolen company to secure high-yield private debt. I started with Harrison's former employer. It was a mid-sized medical supply distributor located in the suburbs. Using public commercial databases and industry regulatory filings, I tracked their quarterly executive transitions. Harrison had not resigned to explore new opportunities. He had been quietly ousted 3 months ago, right around the exact time my mother suddenly needed my round-the-clock help at the guest house. But simply losing a job does not drive a family with old money and deep social connections to commit blatant corporate fraud. My father could easily cover Harrison's luxury condo mortgage for a year, while he found a new impressive-sounding vanity role. There had to be a massive invisible liability hiding just off the books. I expanded my search parameters. I looked into public civil court dockets across 3 states. I scanned property records and commercial liens. Then I cross-referenced the specific private equity firm that had pulled my company credit. The firm specialized in one very particular type of lending. They covered distressed margin calls and massive speculative trading losses for wealthy individuals who needed fast cash to avoid public ruin. It took me 2 hours of relentless methodical digital digging to find the footprint. It was buried under a shell company, but people like my brother always leave a trail. Harrison had opened a series of aggressive, highly leveraged trading accounts through a shadow LLC registered in Delaware. During the massive tech stock fluctuations over the past 6 months, he had engaged in catastrophic, reckless day trading. He was buying heavily on margin betting money he absolutely did not have on volatile market swings, entirely convinced that his Ivy League pedigree made him a financial genius. When the market violently corrected, the margin calls came due all at once. He was completely wiped out. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the data illuminating my dual monitors. The numbers were staggering. It was not just a bad investment. It was an extinction-level event for his personal finances. Harrison was not just unemployed. He was personally in debt for $3 million. The predatory private equity lenders had given him a strict, immovable deadline to produce substantial collateral or face personal bankruptcy and total asset seizure. Harrison had panicked. He had gone to our father. Richard, realizing his golden son was about to be publicly ruined, dragged through civil court and stripped of his country club status, had concocted a desperate, illegal scheme to save the sacred family name. They did not want my company because they thought Harrison could successfully run it. They did not care about my proprietary software or my carefully cultivated client list. They did not even want the revenue. They wanted my company so they could instantly offer it to the private equity vultures as hard collateral for a $3 million bridge loan. My father had completely manufactured the story about his $50,000 gift, being a silent partnership to convince the lenders that he had the legal authority to pledge my corporate assets. He had promised the aggressive creditors that his daughter was stepping down and transferring her majority stake to her brother. The dinner ambush at the country club was a forceful, desperate attempt to make that lie a reality before the ink dried on the term sheets the following morning. They were entirely willing to hand over my life's work, my employees' livelihoods, and my entire financial future to a group of ruthless debt collectors just to cover Harrison's gambling losses. They were going to feed me to the wolves to save him. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was 4 p.m. Harrison was meeting with the creditors tomorrow at 10. My family fully believed I was sitting in my office, crying into a cardboard box, helplessly preparing to surrender my empire to them. They were wrong. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my corporate attorney's direct line. It was time to stop being the invisible daughter and start building a cage they could never escape. The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of my office. Most people would have spent the night crying. Most people would have picked up the phone, screamed at their parents, and demanded an explanation for why their own brother was actively trying to destroy their life. I did not do any of that. Screaming is an emotional reaction. It surrenders control to the person who hurt you. I am an auditor. I prefer cold, hard data. At exactly 8 a.m, I dialed my corporate attorney, Jonathan. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I told him to run a comprehensive sweep of every public financial registry connected to my corporate entity. I wanted him to pull uniform commercial code filings, state lien registries, and any pending asset transfer declarations. He put me on a brief hold. When he came back on the line, his usually composed tone carried a distinct edge of alarm. "Claire," he said, taking a slow breath, "there is a preliminary asset transfer pledge filed in Delaware 48 hours ago. It lists your compliance firm as the primary collateral for a $3 million commercial bridge loan." I stared out the window at the morning traffic crawling along the avenue below. "Who is the listed guarantor?" I asked. "Harrison," he replied. and it bears a digital signature that exactly matches your corporate authorization stamp. My brother had forged my name. He had essentially committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to pledge my life's work to a predatory lending firm. He did not just cross a boundary, he committed a felony. I asked Jonathan to send me the exact digital footprint of the filing. Every document uploaded to a state registry carries an IP address and a timestamp. I needed to see exactly where the crime was committed. 10 minutes later, the file appeared in my inbox. I ran the IP address through a standard cybersecurity geolocation tool. The digital trail did not lead to Harrison's luxury condo in the city. It led directly to the router installed in my parents' suburban estate. It pointed to the exact same study where my father kept his mahogany desk and his bottles of expensive scotch. They had done it together. My father had sat right next to his golden boy and watched him steal my identity to save their precious social standing. To make sense of how a supposedly respectable family could casually conspire to commit federal fraud, you have to understand the toxic theology of appearances that ruled our household. My parents worshipped at the altar of public perception. Everything they did was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to convince the neighbors, the country club, and the local business community that we were flawless. Harrison was the absolute centerpiece of that massive illusion. From the time he was a young boy, he was taught that consequences were simply minor obstacles meant for other people. When he crashed his first car while driving recklessly at 19, my father did not ground him or make him pay for the damages. Richard simply made a few discreet phone calls, wrote a massive check to the right local authorities, and bought Harrison a brand new sports car the very next week. My father spent his entire life believing that wealth could sanitize any sin. He operated under the firm conviction that if you possessed enough money and enough influence, the rules of reality simply bent to accommodate your desires. Harrison absorbed this lesson perfectly. He grew into a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable because his father had spent 30 years proving that the ground would always magically soften right before he hit it. They viewed my company the exact same way they viewed everything else in the world. It was not a separate entity built by a separate human being. It was simply another available asset in the family vault, waiting to be liquidated whenever the golden child found himself in a tight spot. They honestly thought I would be too intimidated by my father's towering rage to ever contest the forged documents. They assumed I would ultimately fold, absorb the crushing financial loss, and keep my mouth shut to protect the family name. They forgot that I stopped caring about the family name the moment my father told me to pack my bags and get out of his guest house. I did not care about the pristine reputation they had spent decades building. I only cared about the survival of my firm and the absolute destruction of their illegal scheme. Jonathan stayed on the phone with me while I processed the geolocation data. His advice was immediate and legally sound. "Claire, we need to contact the authorities right now," he urged. "We have undeniable proof of a forged signature on a federal financial document. If we file a police report today, we can freeze the private equity transaction before the loan is ever funded." I looked at the digital signature glowing on my computer screen. I let the silence stretch for a moment while I calculated the variables. "No," I said calmly, "we are not calling the police." Jonathan sounded stunned. "Claire, they are stealing your company. If I call the police today," I explained, "my father will immediately go into crisis management mode. He will hire the most expensive defense firm in the state. He will spin a massive public relations story claiming, 'I am an unstable, bitter sister who gave them verbal permission and then suffered a sudden mental breakdown.' He will bury the narrative in endless litigation and paint me as a hysterical woman. I will spend years fighting his lawyers in court just to prove I'm innocent." I took a slow breath, letting the strategy lock firmly into place. "I do not want to fight a defensive war, Jonathan. I want the private equity creditors to see exactly who they are dealing with. I want the people holding my brother's debt to realize they have been conned by a family of desperate amateurs." I instructed Jonathan to quietly gather every single piece of evidence. I wanted certified copies of the Uniform Commercial Code filings. I wanted the official network logs proving the exact time and location of the forgery. I wanted my verified banking records demonstrating my absolute sole ownership of the company. I wanted the original gift declaration my father had signed 5 years ago, proving he held zero equity in my business. I did not yell. I did not panic. I simply walked over to the supply closet and pulled out a thick navy blue binder. I spent the entire afternoon printing, labeling, and categorizing every piece of forensic proof. I highlighted the mismatched IP addresses. I flagged the legal statutes regarding fraudulent asset pledges. I slid each damning document into clear plastic sleeves, placing them in perfect chronological order. The physical act of assembling the binder felt incredibly grounding. Every page turning was another lock sliding into place. I was building a trap. A quiet, ironclad mechanical trap designed to snap completely shut at the exact moment they thought they had won. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life and my livelihood. I was going to let them sit down at the table, deal the cards, and push all their chips into the center before I showed them my winning hand. The anatomy of a social smear campaign is surprisingly predictable. It does not begin with a loud announcement. It begins with a quiet, coordinated series of whispers. My mother, Susan, was an absolute master of this particular art form. She did not fight with lawyers, contracts, or ledgers. She fought with prayer circles, carefully timed tears, and concerned gossips shared over watered-down martinis at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I sat in my downtown office on a gray, rain-soaked Tuesday morning. The heavy commercial printer in the corner of my suite hummed a steady, rhythmic baritone. It was churning out 50 pages of raw, undeniable data. Bank statements, internet protocol address logs, corporate registry filings. The physical weight of my brother's felony was forming right in front of my eyes. And as that machine printed the absolute truth, my cell phone sat on the edge of my glass desk, vibrating relentlessly with their desperate lies. Susan had clearly gone to work the very minute I walked out of the guest house. I could trace her exact social trajectory simply by reading the incoming text messages lighting up my screen. At 9 in the morning, my Aunt Barbara sent a massive aggressive paragraph. She accused me of being a heartless opportunist. She said she always knew I harbored a deep jealousy of Harrison, but she never imagined I would actually steal his brilliant startup idea, just because he was too trusting to legally trademark it first. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer absurdity of the claim. Harrison could not even manage his own email inbox, let alone engineer and execute a highly complex healthcare compliance algorithm. But Susan had spun a magnificent, completely fictional web. They had always perceived Harrison as the rightful heir to any success in our family, simply because he looked the part. He wore the expensive custom suits, he played golf at the right exclusive courses, and he possessed that unearned, easy confidence that mediocre men use to fail upward. I was just the quiet sister who preferred spreadsheets to socializing. To their social circle, it made perfect logical sense that I was merely a placeholder for his inevitable corporate triumph. She had clearly told the women at her weekly Bible study that I had taken advantage of my brother's creative genius. She told her regular tennis group that I had abruptly abandoned her in the middle of a painful medical recovery, packing my bags in the dead of night, and leaving her helpless and heartbroken. The phone just kept buzzing. A childhood family friend texted to say she was praying for my soul. A cousin I had not spoken to in over 4 years told me I needed to return the company to its rightful owner before I ruined the family name permanently. Every single message was a perfectly crafted dart. They were dipped in poison and cleverly disguised as righteous concern. They were trying to shame me into submission. They wanted me to feel so incredibly small, so intensely isolated, and so socially radioactive that I would surrender my entire life just to be allowed back into the warmth of their approval. In the past, the old version of me would have completely panicked. I would have typed out massive defensive paragraphs in the family group chat. I would have frantically sent screenshots of my original business loans to prove my innocence. I would have begged them to understand that I was the one who wrote the code, hired the staff, and secured the federal clients. I would have twisted myself into knots trying to convince people who were wholly committed to misunderstanding me. But defending yourself against a fabricated reality is a complete waste of oxygen. When you argue with a lie, you legitimize it. You pull out a chair and invite it to sit at the table. I did not give them a seat. I did not reply to a single text message. I did not block their numbers either because their frantic outreach was valuable data. I simply turned off my notifications and let the accusations accumulate like useless background noise. I watched the screen light up with their messy, loud, emotional warfare, And then I turned my attention completely back to the crisp, black and white pages sliding out of the printer tray. It was a fascinating contrast. My family was loud because they were utterly terrified. They were drowning in a $3 million debt, and they were splashing as much water as possible to hide the sinking ship. Their smear campaign was nothing more than a desperate smokescreen. They needed the country club community to view me as a rogue thief. That way, when they officially stole my company and handed it over to the private equity firm, the entire neighborhood would applaud them for taking back what was supposedly theirs. They genuinely believed their social influence could somehow override federal commercial law. They thought a well-timed crying session at a charity luncheon would magically invalidate a notarized corporate ledger. It was the ultimate arrogance of people who had never faced a real consequence in their entire lives. I gathered the warm paper from the printer tray. The sharp smell of fresh toner and ozone filled the quiet room. It was the scent of absolute certainty. I sat down at my desk and opened my heavy navy blue binder. I am a compliance director. My entire career is built on organizing chaos into undeniable facts. I placed the forged asset transfer pledge in the first clear plastic sleeve. I placed the internet routing data that placed the forgery directly inside my father's house in the second sleeve. I inserted the sworn notarized statement from my corporate attorney in the third. I added my original bank statements, the initial incorporation documents, and a copy of the personal gift declaration my father had signed 5 years ago. I created a meticulous table of contents. I used color-coded tabs to separate the financial history from the digital forensics. My mother was busy building a fragile narrative out of whispers and country club rumors. I was building a cage out of concrete and federal statutes. I closed the navy blue binder. The metal ring snapped shut with a sharp echoing click. It sounded exactly like a bank vault locking into place. I ran my hand over the smooth cover. Let them talk. Let my mother send her venomous text messages and gather her sympathetic armies. Let my father boast to his friends about taking the reins of my company. I knew the bridge loan deadline was rapidly approaching. I knew my father was running out of hours to secure the collateral for his son's aggressive private equity creditors. He had tried pure intimidation in the coat room. My mother was currently trying complete social annihilation. They had played every emotional card in their deck, and I had not moved a single inch. I placed the binder carefully into my leather briefcase and fastened the brass clasps. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the sprawling city below. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. I was perfectly calm. The trap was fully constructed, loaded, and waiting. All I had to do now was let them walk right into it. 72 hours. That is exactly how long it took for the absolute silence to break. In the corporate compliance world, we call this the panic threshold. When someone commits federal wire fraud to cover a massive personal debt, they can only maintain the illusion of control for a few days before the reality of the impending deadline completely crushes their composure. For my father, the panic threshold was breached on a Thursday afternoon at exactly 4:15. My phone vibrated against the glass surface of my office desk. I did not need to guess who it was. The text message from Richard was an absolute masterpiece of corporate delusion. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for publicly throwing me out of his guest house into the cold night. Instead, he summoned me. "Claire," the text read. "We are having a final family board meeting tonight at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Private dining room, 7 o'clock sharp. You will bring the signed succession papers. If you fail to appear or refuse to sign, I am calling my bankers tomorrow morning to permanently freeze every single one of your business operating accounts. This is your last chance to do the right thing for your brother." I read the message twice. I felt a very faint, almost invisible smile form on my lips. He was bluffing. It was a massive, desperate, entirely transparent bluff. Richard had absolutely no legal authority to freeze my business accounts. He was not a signatory on my corporate ledgers. He had no power of attorney. He possessed zero equity in my firm. He was simply a man who was so accustomed to his wealth, making him invincible, that he genuinely believed he could command the commercial banking system through sheer force of will. He thought I was still an intimidated 26-year-old girl who would tremble at the very idea of his wrath. He had no idea he was threatening a woman who audited federal financial institutions before lunch. I picked up my phone and typed a single-word response. Confirmed. I spent the next 2 hours finishing my quarterly compliance projections. I cleared my inbox. I instructed my receptionist to route all evening calls to the answering service. Then I went home to my downtown loft to prepare for the meeting. When you are walking into an ambush, your physical presentation is your first line of defense. I bypassed my usual comfortable office wear and reached for the armor. I chose a tailored midnight blue suit. Sharp lapels, perfect seams, no jewelry except my silver watch. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot. I did not want a single strand out of place. I did not want to look like a daughter coming to beg for her family to take her back. I wanted to look like an executioner. If you have ever been summoned to a family meeting that felt more like a firing squad, you know exactly how heavy the air feels in those final hours before you arrive. People who rely on manipulation always prefer to isolate their targets. They bring you into their territory, surround you with their allies, and expect the sheer weight of their collective disapproval to force you into submission. They rely on your fear of making a scene. But I had long ago stopped fearing scenes. I walked over to my kitchen island. The heavy navy blue binder sat precisely where I had left it. Inside were the internet routing logs, the forged asset transfer pledge, the certified bank records, and the foundational corporate documents proving my absolute sole ownership of my compliance firm. I ran my fingertips over the smooth cover. I felt the cold, hard weight of undeniable truth. I placed the binder carefully inside my leather briefcase and fastened the brass clasps. I took my car keys from the hook by the door and walked out. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club took exactly 38 minutes. The evening sky had bruised into a deep, stormy purple. The air was thick with the heavy humidity of an impending rainstorm. I pulled up to the grand entrance, handed my keys to the valet, and walked through the heavy glass front doors. The country club always smelled exactly the same. It was a suffocating blend of expensive floor wax, roasted tenderloin, and old complacent money. It was the smell of a closed system where everyone agreed to ignore the rot as long as the surface remained polished. I bypassed the main dining room. I ignored the hostess, trying to intercept me with a polite smile. I knew exactly where I was going. The private dining rooms were located down a long, dimly lit corridor lined with oil paintings of former club presidents. The thick, imported carpets absorbed the sound of my heels. The silence in that hallway was heavy, almost oppressive. It felt like walking down the sterile corridor of a hospital just before a grim diagnosis is delivered. I stopped in front of the heavy mahogany door of the Roosevelt room. I did not knock. I simply turned the brass handle and pushed the door wide open. The temperature in the room was chilling. The long, polished walnut table was set for a formal dinner, complete with heavy silver cutlery and stiff white linen napkins. But absolutely no one was eating. My family was clustered near the head of the table. My mother, Susan, sat with her hands tightly folded in her lap, wearing a stiff pastel dress that made her look like she was attending a highly uncomfortable funeral. Jessica, my sister-in-law, was picking nervously at a cloth napkin. The heavy scent of her floral perfume was aggressively battling the smell of roasted garlic drifting from the kitchen. Harrison was sweating. He looked absolutely terrified. He held a highball glass with both hands, his knuckles completely white, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, the exact moment I walked in. He looked like a man who knew the floor beneath him was about to give way. My father Richard stood at the head of the table. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a look of absolute arrogant certainty. He puffed out his chest, completely confident that his threatening text message had brought his disobedient daughter to heel. He expected me to walk in with my head down, clutching the signed succession papers, ready to surrender my entire life to save his golden boy. But as my eyes swept past my family, I noticed the anomaly. They were not alone. Sitting at the far end of the table, perfectly still and entirely out of place in this suburban country club, were two men. They wore sharp, aggressive charcoal suits. They had the cold, clinical posture of apex predators. They did not have drinks in front of them. They had thick leather portfolios and expensive fountain pens. These were not family friends. These were not country club associates. They were the private equity creditors. Harrison had actually brought his loan sharks to the family dinner. My father had orchestrated this entire setup. He wanted the creditors in the room to witness the glorious, seamless transfer of my multi-million-dollar company directly into his son's incompetent hands. Richard genuinely believed that by parading me in front of these ruthless financial operators, the sheer pressure of the room would force me to sign away my firm without a single word of protest. He thought the presence of the very men Harrison owed $3 million to would terrify me into compliance. He looked at me with a triumphant, menacing smile. He gestured toward the two men with a sweeping theatrical wave of his hand. "Claire," my father said, his voice booming across the quiet room, "I am so glad you finally decided to be reasonable and join us. We have some very important guests tonight who are eager to finalize our new family business arrangement." I stood perfectly still in the doorway. I did not break eye contact with my father. I felt the heavy handle of my leather briefcase pressing against my palm. The navy blue binder inside seemed to pulse with a quiet, devastating energy. Harrison swallowed hard. His terrified eyes shifted from the creditors to me, silently begging me to play along with the grand illusion. Susan looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Jessica stopped picking at her napkin, her expression caught somewhere between dread and utter desperation. They were all trapped in a spectacular $3 million lie, and they were holding their breath, waiting for me to be the sacrificial lamb that paid their debt. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. I let them feel the absolute suffocating weight of the moment. Then I stepped fully into the room, let the heavy mahogany door click shut behind me, and prepared to burn their entire illusion to the ground. The Roosevelt Room at the Oak Ridge Country Club was explicitly designed for intimidation. It featured heavy mahogany paneling, dim amber lighting, and the faint metallic tang of polished silver. It was a space built for men who wanted to carve up businesses over rare steaks and expensive bourbon. I stood just inside the doorway and took a clinical inventory of the room. I process environments the exact same way I process federal compliance audits. I look for anomalies. I look for the hidden liabilities. The two men sitting opposite my father were the immediate red flags. They were clearly not members of the club. They did not wear the relaxed, unstructured cashmere of generational wealth. They wore the sharp-tailored armor of aggressive commercial debt collection. The older man had a face like a closed bank vault, entirely devoid of warmth or social grace. The younger man was methodically tapping a heavy gold pen against his leather folio with a quiet, predatory patience. They smelled faintly of cold leather and black coffee. My father cleared his throat. He recognized that the power dynamic in the room was dangerously unstable, so he immediately deployed the booming, jovial voice he used for ribbon-cutting ceremonies and corporate charity galas. He wanted to coat the raw panic in the room with a thick, impenetrable layer of executive confidence. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, extending his right hand toward me like a game show host presenting a grand prize. "I told you she would be here. This is my daughter Claire." He chuckled. It was a deep, hollow sound that bounced awkwardly off the wooden walls and died before it reached the other end of the table. "She is stubborn, she is absolutely brilliant, and she is entirely exhausted from building this little startup from the ground up," he said. The two creditors did not smile. They did not nod. They simply stared at me with flat, calculating eyes. They were evaluating a piece of property. Richard began to pace slowly behind his empty chair. He was weaving a narrative out of thin air, attempting to build a solid bridge over a massive financial canyon. As we discussed in our preliminary meetings, Richard continued projecting his voice to fill the heavy silence. "Claire is finally ready to step down. She has done the grueling back-end work. She wrote the algorithms. But a company with this kind of federal contract volume needs a seasoned, experienced executive to navigate the next phase of rapid expansion. It is time to let her brother take the reins." He placed a heavy hand squarely on Harrison's shoulder. Harrison flinched slightly under the weight of it. "A true family business always consolidates its leadership when the stakes get high," Richard proclaimed. "We are keeping it all in-house. We are ensuring the collateral on your term sheets is managed by a true visionary. We are ready to execute the transition tonight." It was a spectacular, desperate performance. If I did not know that my brother was $3 million in debt to the men sitting across from him, I might have actually believed the smooth, polished narrative. Richard was trying to sell them a comforting story. He was pitching the image of a weary female founder, gratefully handing her life's work over to the highly capable men of the family. Susan sat perfectly still at the edge of the table. Her hands were gripped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white against her silk dress. Jessica stared fixedly at her water glass, her chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic breaths. They were all actively participating in the grand illusion. They were gambling their entire social existence on the blind hope that I would be too intimidated by the presence of these ruthless financial operators to voice an objection. Harrison suddenly moved. He picked up a thick stack of legal documents from the center of the table. The crisp white paper rustled loudly in the suffocating quiet of the dining room. He slid the packet across the stark white linen tablecloth until it bumped directly against the edge of my place setting. I glanced down at the top page. The bold black ink spelled out the words, "Transfer of majority stake" in clear, unyielding font. Harrison reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. He placed it carefully on top of the signature line. It was the exact same set of pages my father had tried to force on me in the coat room during the anniversary gala. Now the demand was being presented in front of a live, highly dangerous audience. Harrison leaned across the table. The smell of his expensive designer cologne mixed sickeningly with the acrid scent of his nervous sweat. He dropped his voice to a desperate, ragged whisper that only I could hear over the hum of the air conditioning. "Just sign it, Claire," he pleaded. His eyes were wide, glassy, and completely hollowed out by fear. "Do not make a scene in front of them," he whispered, leaning closer. "Please, you do not understand what these guys will do to me if this falls apart tonight. Just sign the paper and we can work out the details later. I promise I will make it right." In the corporate compliance world, a forced signature under duress is the easiest anomaly to spot. It always leaves a trail of erratic behavior. Harrison was practically vibrating with panic. He was begging me to commit financial suicide, to cover a $3 million margin call he had hidden from everyone but our father. He assumed the social contract of family loyalty would override my fundamental understanding of basic contract law. He assumed I would prioritize his comfort over my own survival. It was a staggering display of entitlement. He was a drowning man demanding that I hand over my only boat, fully expecting me to tread water in the freezing ocean while he sailed back to shore. I did not pick up the silver pen. I did not even look at the documents again. Instead, I looked at my family. I stripped away the designer labels, the country club memberships, and the decades of manufactured superiority. I looked at them the precise way an actuary looks at a rapidly failing portfolio. I saw the raw, pulsing desperation hiding right behind their tailored clothes. I saw a father who was entirely willing to destroy his daughter's future to protect a son who had never earned a single thing in his entire life. I saw a mother who valued her neighborhood reputation and her pristine social calendar far more than her own child's security. I saw a brother who fundamentally believed that his incompetence was my financial responsibility. They fully expected me to fold. They had spent 31 years conditioning me to absorb their damage to quiet my own needs and to be the ultimate shock absorber for every single one of Harrison's spectacular failures. They truly thought the sheer terror radiating from the men at the end of the table would break my resolve. I let the heavy silence stretch. I let the air in the room grow thick and unbearable. I let the two creditors watch the tension build until it felt like the mahogany walls were going to crack. Then I reached out. I did not reach for the silver pen. I bypassed the legal documents completely. I reached for the tall crystal glass of sparkling water resting near the center of my place setting. The glass was cold. Tiny beads of condensation pressed against my fingertips. I lifted it slowly, feeling the solid weight of the crystal in my hand. I took a calm, deliberate sip. The carbonation burned slightly on my tongue, sharp and exceptionally grounding. I set the glass back down on the white linen cloth. The soft clink of the crystal sounded like a gavel striking wood. I bypassed my father completely. I ignored my brother pleading beside me. I ignored my mother holding her breath. I turned my head and looked directly into the flat, calculating eyes of the two private equity creditors sitting at the far end of the mahogany table. The air in the Roosevelt room tasted like expensive scotch and poorly concealed panic. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the two men sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. They were the apex predators of the financial food chain. They were men who dealt exclusively in distressed assets, aggressive bridge loans, and desperate borrowers. They were absolutely not accustomed to being played for fools by suburban amateurs. Up until this exact fraction of a second, They had operated under the firm assumption that they were about to seamlessly carve up a highly profitable compliance firm as hard collateral. I was about to show them that the prime meat on their plate was lethally poisoned. I completely ignored my father. I did not look at Harrison, who was practically vibrating with terror in his tailored suit. I did not look at my mother, who was holding her breath so tightly that her narrow shoulders trembled against the stiff fabric of her dress. I focused exclusively on the older of the two creditors. He had a face carved out of solid granite and eyes that missed absolutely nothing in a room. "Gentlemen," I said. My voice was perfectly measured. It was pitched at the exact cool, detached volume I use when presenting a catastrophic audit failure to a hostile corporate board. Before you proceed to underwrite my brother's substantial personal debt, I believe it would be in your best financial interest to review the actual ownership structure of the firm you are attempting to leverage tonight. My father's arrogant, triumphant smile vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of profound, staggering confusion. He opened his mouth to interrupt, to launch into another booming, jovial redirection designed to silence the women in his family. But I did not give him the oxygen. I unlatched the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed sharply in the dead silence of the private dining room. I reached inside and withdrew the heavy navy blue binder. It was the physical manifestation of my entire professional career. It was 3 inches of undeniable, documented chronological truth. I placed the binder flat on the crisp white linen tablecloth. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I slid it straight down the center of the table. It glided effortlessly past my father, past my sweating brother, past the untouched plates of roasted tenderloin, and stopped precisely between the 2 private equity men. If you open to the first clear tab, I instructed calmly, you will find the original founding documents and capitalization table for my compliance company. You will see that I am the sole operational and financial owner. You will also find a notarized gift declaration signed 5 years ago by Richard. That document explicitly confirms that his initial $50,000 contribution was a personal gift. It was given without any expectation of future equity, without repayment terms, and completely without operational control. If you have ever had to dismantle a massive lie that your own family built against you, you know exactly how fast your heart beats in a moment like this. But you also know the profound, absolute clarity that comes when you finally decide to stop protecting the people who never protected you. If you know that exact feeling, tell me where you are watching from in the comments right now. Now let me tell you what happened when those financial predators opened my binder. The younger creditor leaned forward and flipped open the heavy cover. The older man adjusted his expensive cuffs and looked down at the very first page. Under the red tab, I continued pacing my words to perfectly match the turning of their pages. You will find the preliminary asset transfer pledge that was filed in the state of Delaware exactly 48 hours ago. It is the specific document listing my firm as the primary collateral for your $3 million bridge loan. I assume you are intimately familiar with that paperwork. Neither man spoke. They simply stared at the printed sheets. The younger man stopped tapping his gold pen. That document, I stated clearly, contains a forged digital signature. It is my signature, but I did not sign it. I did not authorize that transfer. I did not agree to pledge my life's work, my employees' livelihoods, and my federal contracts to cover my brother's catastrophic day trading margin calls. Harrison let out a sound that was half gasp and half whimper. He sank lower into his heavy leather dining chair, desperately trying to physically fold himself into the upholstery. He looked like a child caught stealing not a 30-year-old executive. And under the final yellow tab, I said, driving the last nail into their fraudulent coffin, you will find the certified cybersecurity geolocation logs. My legal team pulled the Internet Protocol address attached to that fraudulent filing. It traces back directly to the wireless router installed in my father's suburban estate. The forgery was committed under his roof on his personal network. Just 2 days ago, I watched the color completely drain from the faces of the 2 creditors. These were men who lived and breathed risk assessment and legal exposure. They realized in real time that they were not securing a bulletproof corporate asset to back their risky loan. They were sitting in a private dining room with 2 men who had just committed blatant, easily provable federal wire fraud. If they moved forward with the term sheets, they would be active participants in a massive criminal conspiracy. The older creditor slowly closed the navy blue binder. The sound of the heavy cardboard meeting the table was deafening. He looked at my father with an expression of absolute terrifying disgust. It was the exact look you give a desperate street con artist who tried to sell you a worthless piece of glass. Richard, the older creditor, said. His voice was dangerously soft, completely devoid of the forced camaraderie they had shared moments earlier. What exactly is this? My father exploded. The polished, confident country club patriarch completely vanished. He was instantly replaced by a cornered, panicked tyrant who realized his money could no longer buy his way out of the room. He slammed his closed fist down onto the solid mahogany table with a violent crash. The heavy crystal water glasses jumped and rattled against the silverware. "This is absolute nonsense!" Richard roared. His face was flushed a deep mottled crimson. The veins in his neck strained visibly against his expensive silk collar. "She is lying to you. She is a hysterical, ungrateful child throwing a massive tantrum because she simply cannot handle the pressure of running the business anymore. Claire, you sit down right now and you keep your mouth shut." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He expected me to shrink. He expected the booming volume of his voice and the sheer physical aggression of his posture to trigger 31 years of conditioned obedience. He truly thought if he just yelled loudly enough, reality would somehow warp and bend to fit his aggressive commands. He thought he could bully the facts into submission. I did not shrink. I did not sit down. I did not look away. I did not even blink. I pushed my heavy dining chair back and stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my tailored midnight blue jacket. I looked at the man who had ordered me out of his guest house into the cold night, simply because I refused to be a convenient, compliant pawn in his twisted family game. My pulse was perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and controlled. My voice never rose above a calm, conversational, professional boardroom volume. "You threw me out," I said. I looked directly into my father's panicked, furious eyes, watching the absolute desperation burning behind his anger. "You threw me out into the street because you honestly thought I desperately needed your shelter. You thought your money, your social status, and your grand estate were the only things keeping me safe in this world." I paused, letting the cold silence swallow the last echoes of his shouting. I looked at Harrison, who was openly weeping, now his face buried in his hands. I looked at my mother, who was staring at me with a horrified, dawning realization of what they had just lost. "You completely miscalculated," I told my father. "You did not realize that I was the only thing keeping the roof from caving in on you. I was the actual asset. And you just gave me every single piece of evidence I need to put your golden son in a federal prison." The older of the two creditors stood up. The heavy wooden legs of his chair scraped sharply against the polished hardwood floor, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He did not raise his voice. Men who hold that much financial leverage never need to shout. He simply buttoned his suit jacket with complete mechanical precision and looked down at my father. He looked at him not as a fellow businessman, but as a massive legal liability. "Richard," the man said, keeping his tone dangerously flat, "you brought us here tonight under the explicit promise of securing a clean corporate asset. Instead, you have actively attempted to make us accomplices to a federal crime. That is an insult to my firm, and it is a fatal mistake for your son." The younger creditor did not even bother to offer a parting remark. He simply slid his heavy gold pen back into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and began methodically zipping his leather portfolio shut. "The $3 million margin debt is called in," the older man continued. "The grace period is officially terminated. We expect the entire balance transferred in full by 9 a.m. tomorrow. If the funds are not wired by the opening bell, our legal department will initiate immediate asset seizure. Furthermore, we are formally submitting the digital footprint of this forged pledge to our criminal fraud division for immediate review. I highly recommend you retain competent defense counsel. Enjoy the rest of your evening." They turned and walked out of the private dining room. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of wolves, leaving a carcass that was no longer worth their time. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, sealing my family inside the exact nightmare they had tried to force onto me. The psychological and physical collapse of the room was instantaneous. Harrison did not just sit down. His entire body gave way as if the bones had been surgically removed from his legs. He folded into his chair like a collapsing building, his face buried deep in his hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob that sounded completely pathetic in the empty space. Jessica abandoned her posture entirely. She slumped forward over the white linen tablecloth, weeping openly into her folded arms, her tears completely ruining her pristine makeup. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her luxury country club lifestyle. She finally realized that the man she married was not a titan of industry, but a pathetic gambler who had just lost their entire world. Susan was paralyzed. My mother sat frozen in her seat, staring blankly at the empty space where the creditors had just been sitting. Her eyes were wide with absolute bottomless horror. For 30 years, she had dedicated every waking moment to shielding Harrison from the slightest discomfort. She had happily smoothed over his bad grades, his reckless driving, and his remarkably mediocre career. Now she was staring at the undeniable, terrifying reality that her beautiful golden boy was heading straight for a federal prison cell, and absolutely no amount of baked goods or church gossip could save him. I reached across the table and retrieved my navy blue binder. I placed it gently inside my leather briefcase. I fastened the brass clasps one by one. The metallic snaps rang out loud and clear. Claire, wait. The voice was so thin and desperate I almost did not recognize it. I looked up. My father was leaning heavily against the table. The arrogant tycoon from 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was an old, terrified man. His face was pale and his hands were physically shaking. Claire! Please, he begged. His voice actually broke on the second word. You cannot just leave us here. You have the capital. Your firm is pulling in millions. You could write a check tomorrow morning and clear this entire mess. We are your family. We are begging you. You have to help your brother pay this off. It was a fascinating psychological phenomenon. Even after everything he had done, even after trying to steal my company and destroy my future, his fundamental programming remained exactly the same. He truly believed that my money was simply a reserve fund for their mistakes. He believed I owed them my salvation. I picked up my briefcase. I looked at my father with a sense of profound, absolute calm. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no pity. I felt nothing at all. I do not invest in failing assets, I said. I turned my back on them and walked out the door. I walked back down the long, dimly lit corridor lined with the oil paintings of past presidents. My heels clicked against the hardwood margins of the carpet, beating out a steady, triumphant rhythm. I bypassed the main lobby and stepped out through the front doors. The rainstorm had passed, leaving the night air cool and incredibly sharp. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of wet asphalt and fresh wind. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car. I did not look back at the building. I knew exactly what was burning down inside. The fallout over the next 6 months was an absolute masterclass in cause and effect. When you build an entire legacy on the incredibly fragile foundation of social appearances, the universe eventually collects its debts with staggering interest. Harrison did not secure the $3 million by the opening bell. The private equity firm moved with terrifying speed. They froze his personal accounts and seized his luxury condo. 2 weeks later, the state authorities formally indicted him for wire fraud and identity theft based on the digital evidence the creditors forwarded to the prosecutor. My father tried to save him. Richard desperately liquidated everything to cover the massive legal fees and keep his son out of a federal penitentiary. The sprawling suburban estate went on the market in early November. It sold at a massive loss to a cash buyer. The country club politely but firmly revoked their membership. Susan was completely excommunicated from her social circles. The same women she had tried to weaponize against me simply stopped returning her phone calls. The family name they had worshipped for decades became a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. They traded everything they owned just to secure a plea deal that confined Harrison to house arrest and 5 years of strict probation. They were socially and financially ruined. Meanwhile, my life moved forward with brilliant momentum. I hired 3 new compliance directors. I expanded our operations to the East Coast. My firm doubled its annual revenue by the end of the 4th quarter. Removing the massive emotional anchor of my toxic family freed up an incredible amount of space in my mind. I sit here today at my pristine glass desk on the 42nd floor of my downtown headquarters, watching the early sun bleed through the morning fog over the Chicago River. The executive suite is perfectly silent, and my coffee is black. It is the exact same view I had when this nightmare started, but the lens has completely changed. There is a profound lesson hidden in the wreckage of all this. Society tells us that family is an unbreakable bond. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires endless sacrifice and infinite forgiveness. But love that demands you to sign away your livelihood is not love. It is an acquisition strategy. When people show you over and over again that they only value you for the resources they can extract from you, it is your absolute right to close the account. You do not owe your peace to the people who actively manufacture your chaos. You cannot heal someone who is determined to break you. You can only walk away and build a fortress they cannot breach. If you have ever found yourself setting an ironclad boundary against a deeply entitled family member, I want to hear your story. Have you ever had to walk away from people who demanded everything and offered nothing in return? How did you finally find the courage to lock the door? Please drop a comment below and share your experience. Your story might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to finally walk away. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about claiming your worth. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.